But of course, as you see with Ukraine, where ballistic missiles and drones together have destroyed 80% of Ukraine's electricity grid, causing extensive power cuts now for years across the country, that kind of damage is very expensive and very difficult to repair, and in wartime even more difficult to repair. So ballistic missiles also, of course, kill people in a way that cyber attacks don't. So I think this new threat does have to be much higher up the UK defence and the NATO defence agenda.
Front page of the Sunday Times is an exclusive investigation that finds that the UK is increasingly vulnerable to ballistic missile attacks. And a growing number of NATO countries are frustrated that the government isn't contributing enough to defensive shields across Europe. Well, let's welcome to the show Professor Jamie Shea, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Professor, thank you so much for giving us your time. Welcome to the show.
Oh, good afternoon, Alexis.
What are your thoughts when you read the Sunday Times investigation?
Well, I didn't think that it sort of showed anything particularly new. Because this threat to NATO countries in general from ballistic missiles has been around for some time. NATO was focusing, for example, already a couple of decades ago on building up a ballistic missile shield against Iran. But certainly it's become massively more acute in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the greater tension between the UK, NATO and Russia, the way in which Russia has been using massive salvos of missiles and drones, up to 100, 120 per day against Ukraine. And of course, the fact that other adversaries of the West, I mentioned Iran, but also the Houthis in Yemen or North Korea, are developing ballistic missiles as well. So I think, yes, the UK is vulnerable to this increased threat, but it's a general NATO problem, because if a ballistic missile is heading towards the UK obviously won't want it to enter British airspace before trying to shoot it down, but will want NATO allies already to be engaging that missile well in advance. So it's how the UK looks after itself, but also contributes to a greater NATO effort in this area.
And Professor, on the scale of threats, I mean, a lot of people have been getting in touch saying, well, what about the cyber threats? What about the fact that countries don't even have to launch any weapons against a country, but they can disable it by taking down its power systems or its communication systems? So in the scale of threats, is a ballistic attack quite high up?
It is, Alexis, for the simple reason, of course, that it does much more permanent damage. You can have a cyber attack, and this has happened to the UK and all Western countries and Ukraine in recent times, and suffer temporary damage, but you can reroute the system or on other servers, you get patches against the type of malware or bug being used, and get back up and running sort of pretty quickly. It's very difficult, Alexis, to find an example of a cyber attack which has sort of kept a system offline for more than a few hours or a few days. But of course, as you see with Ukraine, where ballistic missiles and drones together have destroyed 80% of Ukraine's electricity grid, causing extensive power cuts now for years across the country, that kind of damage is very expensive and very difficult to repair, and in wartime even more difficult to repair. So ballistic missiles also, of course, kill people in a way that cyber attacks don't. So I think this new threat does have to be much higher up the UK defence and the NATO defence agenda.
Many people have also been making the point that quite a lot of the air defence systems have been transferred to Ukraine for obvious reasons, but they've not yet been replaced. Has that left us more vulnerable, do you think?
Yes, Alexis, it certainly has, because it's also a more worldwide problem. For example, the United States has got this extremely good system called THAAD, high altitude air defense, but they haven't sent it to Europe. Recently, they've sent one to Israel, a decision by the Biden administration to parry further attacks from Iran, and they've deployed one in South Korea. Many of the Patriot systems, which is the US air and missile defense system, probably one of the best. Many of those, for example, from the Netherlands, from Germany, recently from Romania, have also been transferred to Ukraine. And the Germans have got a good one too, called IRIS-T, where last a couple of weeks ago, the German government agreed to transfer yet another to Ukraine. So, of course, this is, to some extent, a good cause, but it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's leaving NATO now more vulnerable. But the Ukrainians, at the same time, are continuing to request further NATO air defense assets, given the fact that Russia is continuing to attack Ukraine. So it's going now to be a sort of challenge globally to produce, not just for Europe, but for the Middle East, for South Korea, for Japan, many more high-performing air defense systems, and to make sure that you distribute the right assets in the right place at the right time, which also means the capacity to move them around quickly if, for example, the threat to Europe suddenly becomes much greater than the threat to Israel in the Middle East.
Professor, it sounds to me that we need a much more integrated solution when it comes to NATO and how it functions. Is that possible? Can we get every country paying the amount that they need to be paying? As you said, the missiles being at the right place at the right time. Is NATO designed to function like that? And has it ever functioned?
It is, Alexis, stepping up to the mark. For example, just this past summer, Poland inaugurated a second NATO missile interceptor site. The first one was already operational in Romania a few years back, with Turkey hosting the radar that does the early warning and the tracking of the missile trajectories. So that is progress, and this is based on an American interceptor called SM-3. So NATO does have some degree of protection. But this system, when it was originally conceived, was conceived against Iran, the threat from the south rather than the threat from Russia in the east. And it was conceived against a kind of rogue strike, one single missile or one or two, which would be relatively easy to track and intercept. But as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, you see now Iran firing 300 of these things in a single salvo against Israel. And you see Russia using salvos of 100, 120 drones and missiles. So it's coping with this intensity of a possible attack, which is the real challenge. And I think what NATO has to do now is invest much more heavily in opening up further sites. For example, Finland and Sweden have recently joined the alliance, and that opens the possibility of a NATO missile defense site there, which would certainly cover Russian missiles coming from the north up through the Arctic towards the UK or the US or Canada. So NATO has got the good building blocks on which to build, but of course it's a question of moving it up the agenda and finding a way not to rob Peter to pay Paul, but to pay Paul and Peter, i.e. Ukraine and NATO, at the same time. So definitely when it comes to defense industry, a considerable ramp up. And also, Alexis, coming up with more high-performing systems, because we now are in the age of hypersonic missiles, which fly 5 times faster than the old sort and are more difficult to track and intercept. Not impossible, but it is going to require more modern air defense systems.